Hello everyone, welcome to another series of video from Electronics Eternity. This time around we'll be looking into remote controlling endpoint devices using ESP32. Before we get into any details of this project, I would highly recommend that you check my previous video on bootstrap radio button and port forwarding. The content from these videos will help you understand this tutorial better as we will be using somewhat the same concepts in this project. Now, what is meant by remote controlling endpoint devices is that we will try to turn on and off a device by using radio buttons from a website. This website is locally hosted and connected to a local database, like what we can see over here in the screen. In this case, we are using PHP as our database. However, you can choose any database flavors that you're familiar with. The input from this radio button is passed on to and stored in the PHP database. We would then have a status page which reflects the latest value of the radio button, representing either on and off state, which will be the state of endpoint devices. So if I could show you status page. So this is how the status page looks like. It will tell us the current status of the button, whether it's on and off. For the sake of simplicity, my endpoint device is simply a built-in LED from ESP32. But then again, you can use any endpoint devices that you like. For an example, your endpoint devices can be a servo motor or a DC motor, switch, LED, or even relays to control higher voltage devices such as fans, wall lamp, shutter, or just about any devices that you desire. For the ease of understanding, I have broken down this video into three parts, where the first part will be on the ESP code that we're seeing on the left hand side of the screen over here. The second part is on the database processing, and finally we'll be looking into results. Now let's look into the ESP32 code that we will be using for this project. As usual, at the top here we could see Wi-Fi and HTTP client library being included here. Next is two characters, which are the Wi-Fi SSID and the password, and finally the string named button state, which will hold the on and off state. Moving on to void setup. So we initialize the serial communication with our ESP32 and set the built-in LED as the output, and then start connecting to the Wi-Fi by using the begin command. So the while loop over here will continue to run until the connection to the Wi-Fi is established. Once connected, the Wi-Fi will then print out the IP address of your ESP32, right? So if you remember our previous port forwarding video tutorial, we can use our ESP32 IP address to make our port forwarding more secure by restricting the external host that could connect to our port forwarding. Okay, so that's the reason why I have displayed my ESP32 IP address over here. Okay. So now moving on to the void loop. So at the beginning here, you could see uh, an if condition that becomes true when a Wi-Fi is connected. Next, we declare a HTTP client name and use a begin command to initiate the connection to the URL, right? So if you could see, there's XXX over here, right? So this is the URL that I have for my project. The XXX over here simply represents an IP address. Now you need to remember that this IP address is your router's IP address, not the local IP address, which often starts with 192.168 and so on, right? So your router's IP address can be gathered from your modem page, so be sure to get this IP address correct. Again, I would like to remind you to check my previous video on port forwarding to understand this part. Okay. So on the next line here, we are retrieving the HTTP code, and usually any HTTP code that is greater than 0 is good. So we have used that as a condition to proceed with our string processing. So over here is the entire string processing. So we then pass the content of the URL that we connected and store it in a string called payload, right? So this is the get string over here, and this is the string named payload. So if you want to see the HTTP code and the entire content of URL, you can uncomment these two lines that you see over here. However, I no longer need this since I have completed the project, so I have commented this. So it becomes like a bit too tedious in the serial monitor, so I don't want it anymore. But this is like this is important when you are basically developing the project. Okay. So next we are going to look into processing of the URL content, which gets a little tricky. Before anything, you need to see how the content of the URL looks like, right? So this is the web page that I have over here, and this is the content of the URL, right? So when you basically uncomment this part, payload. So this is what you will see, right? So this is basically the HTML code for this particular page over here. So it says button state is off and when does it happen, right? So this is the entire thing in HTML format, and this is how it looks like on the web page. Okay, so so you can change the button status page to whichever format that you like. The concept that we apply still remains the same. So just make sure that the page is not too long, as ESP has a limit to how many characters you can store in a string variable. Okay? So in the first line of code over here, right, if is which is begin which is at the beginning of our string processing part over here, so we are trying to identify there's the word status found, right? So I put the word state here because simply button state. So state is over here. For example, let's just say it's like this particular line here will give us the value of 100. So that means it's the 100 character of the entire URL content, right? So on the following, which is the next one, which is the next index of that we see over here, we're trying to identify the location of the pipe. So we have pipe over here, and as you can see, the pipe over here. So the reason why we're doing this is simply because button state, whether it's on and off, is located between the pipe, as you can see in the URL content, right? So even if you go over here, where's the button state? So you see button state over here, and then you see the pipe over here. So the same applies over here, button state over here, and the pipe over here. So we're just trying to identify like where is the state on and off could be, right? So once we have identified this location, we can use the substring. So we have the substring over here. We can use the substring to pull the characters between the word state and pipe symbol, which will give us either on and off depending on what is the latest value. Once we have it, we then simply print out the value of the button state, right? So, so once we break the very first if loop in our void loop, sorry, my bad. So whatever button state that you have, it will be passed on to the next if condition, and the if condition will then decide whether we should turn on the LED built-in LED or we should turn it off, right? So that's what it does on the next part. So there is an if condition over here. Right now we go on to this one. So so once we break the very first if loop, so this is the very first if loop. So if we break that because the condition is not met, then we have an error message which simply don't denotes that the connection is not working. So we then end the connection, right? So and we allow a delay for another 5 seconds, right? So the code is actually fairly simple. It's just that the string processing gets a bit difficult. Apart from that, it's very simple.
Let's look at the next part of our project, which is database processing. First of all, you need to create a table in your database. So this is the table that I have created. The table will have three column named as ID, created at, and state. ID will be the unique primary key, whereas the created at and state will be the dynamic values that constantly change depending on users input. So users input is gathered from a web page. So if you remember, I've mentioned this project will be about controlling endpoint device. So in order to control an endpoint device, a user interface will be needed to key in our input, which brings us to our next component of project, right? So the next component that we're talking about over here is a web page for user to change the button state from on to off. So if you click submit over here, it basically sends the value as on. If you click off and then you click submit, it basically sends that value and you get connection success or insertion success, right? So this is a simple web page that has on and off radio button. To understand more on how to create this page, be sure to check out my previous tutorial on radio button. How this page works is by simply sending values to the database based on the on and input that we submit from here. So to establish a bridge between our interface web page and to our PHP database, we need to have an action page. So action page will have all the necessary PHP commands that we need in order to update the PHP database that we're looking over here, right? So now let's look at our action page over here, right? So, but before that, right, our radio button web page also need to be linked with this action page by using this one particular command, right? The form which says an action from here will be like linked to this action page, which is what we're going to discuss next. Right, action page is just a random name. You can have any other name that you like as long as it is correctly configured. Now let's look at the content of our action page. Our action page is simply a .php file. We begin with the HTML text, then we have the PHP part of our code, right? So at the beginning, we are simply storing username, credentials, database name to our PHP database. So I've hit my password for security reasons. Next, we will try to connect to the database based on the earlier parameters and throw an error if the connection fails, right? So failure to connect to the page will be shown on the web page when we cannot connect to the database, right? Hmm. Subsequently, we take the example radio variable and we transfer the values into our table. So when example radio equal to option 1, the button state will be on, and whereas button state will be off during option 2. So where do we get this option 1 and option 2 is basically from our radio button. So when it's example equals to option 1, it basically means on, and when it means option 2, it's basically off, right? So that's where we get the option 1 and option 2. We then transfer the query to our database using MySQL query, right? So this is the query that we have, and it's basically transfers the value as remember we have ID and then we have the timestamp and then we have the button state, right? So that's why the code is configured as insert to button state ID created, and these are the values, right? So the page will display insertion success if we successfully send the values to the database. In the event of failure, MySQL will display the MySQL error will be displayed in the page, right? So if we go here, so when we click submit and you get this connection success, insertion success. If you fail to do that, it will then throw your MySQLi error over here. Okay, so as you see, insertion success, connection success. That's what you get. Okay. Now, let's go to the final part of the database processing. That will be our status page. Again, our status page will be a .php file again. In the status page, we would need to connect to the database as usual. The usual credentials need to be declared first before connecting to the database. Okay, so now let's look at the query that will give us our latest value from our button state from the table, right? So this is the query. So, so we need to set the order as descending and limit the output row to 1. Now, why do we do this? We want to sort by descending because we want the latest value and we only want one row of it because only one row from the database table is considered as the latest value. So we then simply run the query at the database and then we fetch the results. The results will be in the matrix format like 0, 0, 0, 1, right? Or 0, 0, and 0, 1. So what you're seeing over here is it's basically saying button state, and then what do we get from the query over here is like you present this value first and then subsequently 0, 1. So 0, 0 over here basically says row 0 and column 0, and over here is row 0 and column 1. So if I show you over here, so you have this on and you have this when. So that's what we try to do over here, button state and when. Okay, so when you click submit, right, and the button state will change automatically. When you click on, the button state will change after like 2 seconds, right? So the reason why it changes after 2 seconds is because we have the refresh command over here. Okay.
So finally, we have come to the last part of our video, so which where we will be looking into the result, right? So as you can see on the left hand side here, I've already uploaded my code into ESP32, and it's printing out the value as button is off, and there is first comma, second comma. As you could remember when we were going through the code, the first comma and the second comma is basically just the separator between state and also this pipe over here. So that's why it's just showing. You can always comment out this particular field if you uh, don't want it, right? So at this point the button state is off, and uh, and uh, and we haven't submitted any value yet. So on the bottom right, you could see I have my ESP32, and my endpoint device is simply a built-in LED. As I have clarified earlier in the tutorial, if you want, it can be any other device acting as your endpoint device, right? So now let's see what happens when we click submit. So we basically we press the radio button over here and then we click submit. It says insertion success, and you can see the button state over here changed, and also over here we can see the start new value is populating, and you can see on the bottom right my built-in LED, which is blue in color, is turning on. Now what happens if I go back and I submit off, and after a while this button state becomes off, and we could see the same in the ESP32 output as well in the serial monitor. And on my bottom right I could see that the built-in LED is no longer on, right? So that's basically about the result, and we have really come to the end of the tutorial, and I really hope you find this video useful. You can basically expand this project into any other IoT or controlling endpoint devices, right? So hope you enjoyed. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you until we meet again.